Welcome everyone to this ANU event on industry opportunities in the decarbonising world. So before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be participating and attending today. I'd also like to acknowledge our co-hosts, the Centre for Policy Development and also CO2 Value Australia, who have been active participants in the development of this program, and I want to acknowledge them. So my main role here is actually to introduce the chair of today's session, Dr. Beck Pearce. So Beck is jointly appointed between the School of Sociology here at ANU and also the Fenner School of Environment and Society. And Beck works on social and political economy aspects of the energy transition. And amongst other things, her PhD was on pricing carbon in Australia. I think she's eminently suited to chair this session. Over to you, Beck.
Thanks, Mark, and echoing your recognition that we're meeting here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands this afternoon. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event titled Industry Opportunities in a Decarbonising World, as Mark said, hosted by the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disasters Solutions, partnering with the Centre for Policy Development. So the rationale for us meeting today is that the global push for decarbonising is accelerating, and we want to ask, in conversation with you and our panellists that I'll introduce in turn, what are the new industry opportunities available in Australia as a result of the shift to a decarbonised economy? And what is required to support communities who are disproportionately impacted? So we're going to bring together 4 excellent speakers for the first half an hour, who I will introduce one by one. And they'll be examining the new job-creating industries, strategies to speed up the circular economy, and the likely international opportunities before us, as well as those questions of inequality underlying decarbonisation. So we're going to have what we've called 5-minute bursts from each of the 4 speakers. The first speaker I'd like to introduce to you all is Toby Phillips. He's the lead of Centre for Policy Development's Sustainable Economy program, working on policy ideas and partnerships to build a more environmentally sustainable economy. Toby's also the co-author of the report Who's Buying? The Impact of Global Decarbonisation on Australia's Regions, which concluded that there are between 100,000 and 300,000 jobs exposed to the changes in global demand for fossil fuel exports here in Australia. But there are also new opportunities over the coming decades that will likely create more jobs than those that are lost. So it's with my great pleasure to ask you to kick us off with 5 minutes of comments. Thanks, Great. Toby.
Thanks, Beck. So yeah, our report, Who's Buying, came out in January. And as Beck said, we looked at the impacts of long-term decline in demand for fossil fuels. So taking projections from the IEA. And, you know, we found that there's big impacts in around half a dozen LGAs. So it's like quite concentrated in a relatively small geographic area. And it's not just mining and export-oriented sectors, but it's also all the industries and sectors that support them. So think about shops, restaurants, hairdressers in these communities. And as Beck mentioned, kind of at the upper end of taking the upper end of projections about how low global demand will drop, that could impact about 300,000 jobs in Australia if we face that level of demand today. So really, it's a challenge of structural transformation of the economy, of the whole Australian economy. And at an aggregate level, I guess the message is it's not a big existential crisis. 300,000 jobs over 30 years, that's about 10,000 jobs a year, which is insignificant actually in the size of the labour market. And that's going to happen whether we like it or not. Like that structural change will happen in response to changes to demand. But I think there's three really important things that we need to think about in how that change is shaped and steered over the coming decades, and to run through them in burst fashion. So the first one is really to focus on the local economies. Like, it's all well and good to say that 10,000 jobs a year, that's insignificant in aggregate in a labour market of 15 million people. But as I said, this is kind of really concentrated in half a dozen LGAs, and it won't be insignificant there, it will be highly significant. And so if the transition is not managed in a way where new opportunities are developed and new industries are built in these places, then there's actually not going to be a social license for transition. And the social license is critically important at the moment. And so because of that concentration in local economies, clear transition planning is important. There needs to be a plan that people trust, they find credible, they can get behind. The second point that I'd make that we need to bear in mind is that structural change isn't always a good thing. And I think, as a simple rule of thumb, if there's a structural transition where people are moving from low productivity work into high productivity work, then that's generally good for the economy. And you look at China over the last 3 decades, big move from agriculture up the manufacturing value chain. It's done remarkable things. Where people are moving from high productivity sectors into lower productivity sectors, then generally that whole process of structural transition is a drag on the total economy. And you can look at, this has happened over the last decades in several Latin American economies as they've moved out of manufacturing. For Australia, that poses a bit of a problem for us because the mining industry and particularly industries associated with fossil fuels are some of our most productive in terms of labour productivity. So the big question is, what are the sectors that people are going to be moving into, and what can we do to make sure that there are as high productivity opportunities as possible? We don't want to move people straight out of mining into the economic structure that we currently have, because frankly, at the moment, a lot of our productivity is powered by these carbon-dependent sectors. And so, the third point then, which kind of ties those together, is that any transition strategy needs to have a big focus on building the new industries that are going to be the engine of productivity in the Australian economy. I think in the short term, renewables is a big part of that, but I would caution that I think a longer term industrial strategy needs to look beyond the energy sector transition. And part of this is simply that, if you forecast 20, 30 years into the future, let's say we've succeeded in transitioning our energy system, the promise of renewable energies is kind of zero marginal cost. Like, it's ubiquitous, it's cheap, it's not the long-term driver of productive output. We need to figure out what are the industries that we can build onto that energy sector. What are the industries that might be energy agnostic? So I'm thinking like digitally traded services, advanced manufacturing. Maybe it's really getting into the critical minerals game. Whatever it is, we've really got to focus on putting a lot more effort into innovation, spinning up new industries, and identifying what Australia's comparative advantage can be in the global economy of 2040 and 2050. So look, I'd wrap up by kind of saying that I think, we're at this point where good climate policy and good economic policy are basically exactly the same thing. And we've really got to kind of treat them as being the same question. And like, it's probably time for a discussion about having a government that has much more opinionated industrial strategy, and that's willing to make much bigger investments in seeding innovation and seeding the new industries that will drive Australia in 2030, 2040 and 2050.
Great. Thank you very much, Toby. And what a useful point for you to land on, that climate policy is good economic policy. The next speaker we have is Professor Paul Burke. Paul Burke is a professor and head of the Arndt Corden Department of Economics in the Crawford School of Public Policy here at ANU. Paul is also a project convener within the Zero Carbon Energy for Asia Pacific Grand Challenge project. And he's published on topics including Australia's climate policy, clean energy export opportunities for Australia, and policy designs to accelerate uptake of solar and wind energy in the Asia Pacific region. So keen to hear your 5-minute burst. Thanks, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Beck. And it's great to see you all here this afternoon. Economists sometimes refer to Australia as a small, open economy. But when it comes to energy, we certainly aren't small. And just touching on the open point as well, we sure better remain open as we look forward to coming decades and really meeting the challenge of decarbonising the global economy. Of course, climate change, we need to not just focus domestically, but a lot of the opportunities are in our region, and we need to be looking very much outward. In our research here at ANU, we have been looking at opportunities for Australia to change its export model. Currently, Australia is the world's #1 exporter of coal and also the world #1 exporter, not of natural gas, but of liquefied natural gas. We're a big player in energy trade internationally. Fortunately, and it's a story which is really becoming more well-known, and Professor Ross Garnaut and others have made a big contribution to that. Fortunately, Australia has huge opportunities for a new export model. We could be exporting products including green ammonia, green electricity from renewable energy, and of course, for those two products, there are large private sector proposals to be exporting to the region. Also, we have other potentials. So production of aluminium in Australia powered using renewable energy, green steel as well, rare earths and so on are very important as the region transitions to zero carbon energy. We have been looking at those opportunities, and as Toby's report touches on, some of those opportunities are not quite where we're extracting coal and gas at the moment. In particular, the Pilbara and Northern Australia have a lot of those opportunities, and the Pilbara is where the iron ore is located as well. One of the big questions for Australia is, can we start to use more of those commodities that we do have in terms of minerals, and to be beneficiating those ores using clean energy, and even producing green aluminium and green steel as final products as well. In the region, things are moving very quickly, and it's a very exciting time for clean energy in countries including Indonesia, Vietnam, China, and India. A key driver of that has been net zero. That concept of net zero has been more popular than many expected, and countries throughout the region have announced net zero commitments, and some of them are very ambitious. For example, Vietnam net zero by 2050, Indonesia also announcing net zero 2060 in that case. The other key driver is technology, and as we know, solar and wind generation, the technologies have been improving so much, they're much cheaper than before, and opportunities are there throughout the region. If it's not sunny, well, it's often quite windy, and the vice versa is true as well. Indonesia, for example, has a lot of solar potential. There are lots of interesting questions there. Where could Australia be economically competitive in exporting clean energy? There will be many competitors. So, for example, liquefied hydrogen, if we were to export that, well, there are lots of competitors out there. Local electricity generation in export destination markets such as Japan, potential competitors in the Middle East and elsewhere. But Australia does have some real opportunities, and green ammonia is looking like a big one. And ammonia, of course, is used for fertilizers and other things. If we could decarbonise the production of ammonia and increase our exports of it, then that really could make a large contribution. Just briefly on the domestic side of things, we've also done some work looking at what happens after closures of coal-fired power stations in Australia. And we found that typically the local unemployment rate increases, which points to the challenge that Toby was talking about. One interesting piece of good news, though, is I just looked up the Latrobe Gippsland SA4 region unemployment rate. It's about 4%, 4.2%. almost at the national average. The Hazelwood Power Station closed several years ago, and Australia really, and in particular the Victorian government, really focused in on that region to try to avoid some of the big negative unemployment outcomes that could have happened and were feared as well. I'll leave it there, Beck, and happy to talk more about it.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. And our next speaker, I'm pleased to introduce, is Sophia Hwang. Sophia is a clean tech COO, circular economy expert, speaker, university lecturer, and a diversity advocate. She's the Chief Operating Officer of Mineral Carbonisation International, a technology platform that transforms CO2 into building materials and other valuable industrial products. Sophia is also a co-founding director of CO2 Value Australia, one of our event co-hosts, and I apologise for not picking that up at the beginning. Mark's nodding at me, thank you. Sophia is also a member of the ACT Climate Change Council and a board member of the Climate Ready initiative. So very keen to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Beck. As Beck said, I'm here wearing two hats, and so I'll give you a little bit of background on both Mineral Carbonation International, or MCI, and CVA, CO2 Value Australia, before I launch into a couple of minutes. So MCI itself is a carbon technology platform, as was mentioned, where we're transforming CO2 from a waste product into valuable materials that can be used as profit, focusing on the hard to abate industries like the steel, cement, and also mining industries and chemical processes as well. So it's basically a natural earth process that absorbs CO2 over millions of years, called weathering. And we've taken that process from millions of years into a matter of minutes in our pilot plant in Newcastle, and validating the different products that we can create, including cements and plasterboards, as well as paper, carpet, basically anything that has a carbonate inside, we can create synthetically from emissions, bound with industrial wastes like steel slags or mine tailings or low-grade minerals, and have been able to actually show that the process is a carbon sink with full life cycle assessments and is scalable into the gigatons. So not an insignificant amount. I joined the team around 2013 as the first employee, and we received about $9 million from the federal government, New South Wales government, and Orica to scale up the technology and build it out. And around 4 years ago, we realised that there wasn't a lot of policy certainty around carbon capture and utilisation. Now, even in this room, I'm sure there's a lot of uncertainty around what is carbon capture and utilisation versus, is it the same as CCS? Is it storage? Because we're actually storing CO2 into minerals, but that doesn't mean that we're CCS. And we get lumped in together quite often because the CCS community likes to call themselves CCUS these days, but that's generally just talking about enhanced oil recovery plus underground injection. So we've had a bit of work to do within the CCU community to show that circular carbon applications are a whole other business model and a whole other way of approaching captured carbon, and carbon that's also sucked out of the atmosphere using direct air capture. So last year, the CSIRO released a report called the CO2 Utilisation Roadmap, which validated some of the techno-economics that MCI had been doing, which showcased that just in their analysis, that we could be locking away 19 million tonnes of CO2 permanently and safely into products like these in Australia using 10 facilities. And in those 10 facilities, we could be making at least $100 per tonne of profit, for CO2. So really, when you look at this business case, if we go to emitting industries like the steel industry and say, hey, you can look at your CO2 as a cost, as a valuable profit-making resource, would you be incentivized to do something? And we've been actually getting quite a lot of interest globally. And also we won #1 clean tech at COP26 last year in Glasgow, which was quite a support for an Australian technology on the global stage that is making quite a lot of waves. So yeah, also the IPCC recently validated that CCU is going to be one of the technology groups that will help us to achieve a net zero 2050 future. So that was quite good. If you look at CCU though itself, because you can turn CO2 into not just building materials, but things like fuels and chemical feedstocks and many other applications. But from my perspective, representing MCI, we have this really compelling just transition argument, which really links into what the previous two speakers were talking about. If we are transforming CO2 from industry into building materials using chemical engineering and geology, these are jobs that are directly relatable to the jobs that are going to be available after coal and other resource intensive industries shuts. And not only that, the jobs that are created are really high paying, good quality jobs as well. So we have a bit of work to do now on the whole industry job creation aspect, which is I'd love to talk to you more about as well. So I guess I'll leave it there. I've got plenty more to say, but it's been, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this dialogue.
Great, excellent, Sophia, and I'm seeing some audience response to the positive message that you've brought. So really excellent news. Our next 5-minute speaker is Tenant Read. Tenant is Principal National Advisor, Public Policy at the AI Group. He has worked heavily on climate and energy issues, advising AI Group leaders on energy and climate policy, and in developing reports on our natural gas supply, energy prices, and energy efficiency. So take it away, Tenant. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to try showing a couple of slides, but I'm also setting myself a rigorous 5-minute limit. So a couple of conceptual thoughts about opportunity, and then a couple of thoughts on the pathways open to industry. So it's helpful to think about the opportunities for Australian industry in a clean economy in a few buckets, some of which we've already talked about. So inputs to clean energy, mineral ones, but also componentry. The building of clean energy itself, there is an awful lot of construction and infrastructure involved, and there are the jobs and a lot of demand associated with that. Although, on the one hand, those jobs are there and then they're not when a project is done, but the total build out that is involved in a net zero pathway is so large over several decades that is potentially a sustained, significant set of activities. The supply of clean energy itself, whether exporting electrons or molecules, and the production of clean energy intensive products. And we're pleased to see more attention being paid to those opportunities, which we think could be very large, both in the metals arena, but also in a range of other products where energy is an important input cost. There's a lot of make it here sentiment about, and this can have two varieties broadly. One is very inward looking. It is, can we get 100% or as close to 100% as possible local content in projects that are happening? It's a very import substitution orientation versus an outward looking export oriented and being embedded in global supply chains approach. To us, the latter looks like it has got greater potential. The opportunities that people are most excited by really do require the continued comfort of our trading partners with being deeply intermeshed in an international supply chain and division of labour. So I think it's important to be clear about what variety of local activity we're trying to generate and go for it in a concerted way. Just on the specific opportunities, so it is also important to have a broader concept of what is involved in industry decarbonisation. We focus a lot on fuel switching. We have some discussion of CCU and CCS, but we do need to think of materials efficiency, the circular economy, and even the nature of the end use services that are being delivered and demand for those as also part of the story, because the total task to net zero is so large that a purely inside the factory boundaries approach to decarbonisation may struggle to get us there. We do need to work on the whole chain. Looking at the opportunities, I think the indication, this is a horrible slide actually to look at, but the indication from the IPCC of where they assess the opportunities to be over the next decade leans heavily on fuel switching and energy efficiency. Although there is a lot of contribution being made off-site in the models that they're assessing from transformation in upstream energy provision. But in particular sectors of great interest, we see some very interesting things. So there are technically available pathways for cement, for steel, for chemicals and other sectors. Now there's some variety here, some role for CCUS, particularly in cement, hydrogen looking the most viable pathway for steel, chemicals it's a bit more complicated. There are significant cost increments likely to, over existing processes, likely to persist for a long time. Now, those cost increments are very competitively relevant between producers. They're not so big when they're translated to final increases in consumer prices. And so this is a really important policy challenge locally and globally. How do we make those industry pathways investable? We're seeing Europe grapple with this with their CBAM as an important new part of the answer. I think we're going to need to focus on that a lot domestically as well. That's been 5 minutes, so I'm going to start my slideshow.
Great. Thank you, Tenant. Great use of PowerPoint. So for the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to engage the panel on a few follow-up questions with regards to these initial comments they've made for us. And then at 5:25 or so, we're going to get them engaged with your questions. So please be sharing on the Zoom Q&A panel if questions are coming up for you. The first question I wanted to open with, perhaps for the whole panel, but I'm going to ask you to speak first, if you don't mind, Toby. Can we get a little bit more local and specific about what these industrial pathways look like, particularly in places that are currently reliant on producing for fossil fuel export? What does it look like in town, in the working lives of the people in the Hunter and the other half dozen postcards that you've been writing about, and perhaps others in the panel want to pick up on that too?
I mean, that is the big question. Like, how do we take this from being kind of high-level abstract talk, and how do we actually do something with it? And I think, you know, the first thing that I would always say is that it's not something for a researcher in Melbourne, which is where I'm based, to come up with. So, you know, the first thing we always say is, like, coming up with this transition planning has to be something that involves the specific communities, the leadership, civil society, business, local council leadership all need to be part of that conversation. What it means in practice, though, and with a bit more of my economist hat on and kind of my sort of policy writer hat on, is for every place it's likely going to look different, but there are things that will be very useful to know that we don't currently know in order to create something that looks like a transition strategy. So I think ideally you want to have some sense of, what's the profile of the skills in the place, what's the profile of the workforce and the demographics, who needs to transition into new roles, who's exiting the labour force altogether, and then also what is the current comparative advantage of this local economy? What's the endowment of infrastructure, of capital stock? Is it close to an export port? Does it have good interlinkages to other parts of the country and other industrial clusters? It really requires that level of analysis to say what the right opportunity for any particular place will be. There's also very, very useful analytical techniques that can be done that look overseas and look at, say, if a country or a region has a comparative advantage in producing products A, B, and C, it could be, say, if you've got a place that produces bicycles, windows, and solar panels all together. Well, if we've got a place that's producing windows and solar panels, maybe it's also could have the right infrastructure and capital stock to produce bicycles. It's kind of really looking at where do you see clusters and agglomeration of particular industries. I did just make up those three just then, but it's that sort of analysis that can then help inform those community level discussions. I think the one last thing I would say is it's something where all levels of government kind of need to come to the table. So while this is something that affects local communities and they absolutely need to be driving the conversation, they don't always have the resources to invest in whether it's skills retraining, whether it's seed funding for new innovative industries. They don't necessarily have the resources. The deep pockets are at state government and federal government. So I think they're critical players in any transition planning too.
Yeah, so go local, but be operating on every level of government. Thank you, Toby. Sophia, did you want to speak a little more to that place-specific vision for industrial transition from your companies and your perspective?
It's something that I think about quite often from my personal perspective, because I grew up in far north Queensland and a lot of my friends from high school work in coal mines. And when we talk a lot about the transition, which is obviously a very triggering word to some people. So now we talk about the transformation. We are really talking about people's real life jobs, and they have families that are relying on these things. So one of the strategies that MCI in particular has been using is looking at specifically those places that are going to have jobs available and creating the business models and the platforms for other businesses to emerge in specifically those regions. We've been focusing on Newcastle, Gladstone and the Illawarra and some places in Western Australia, but it's been largely just not coordinated. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity around that. So I guess that's...
Yeah. Yes. Well, let's pick up on the topic of coordination. As an economist, Paul, what are the policy levers that you see the government using with regards to transition, green transition, and what other levers are available that perhaps this new government might think of?
Yeah, thanks, Beck. When we're thinking about living standards and unemployment, I mean, the very first thing is to have the national policy settings right, to make sure that we are keeping the national unemployment rate as low as it can be and maintaining improvements in living standards. However, it's also very important to keep local communities in mind, and a very people and community focused approach is also really needed, and the states are important here as well. Some of these areas have a huge opportunity. So cities like Newcastle and Wollongong, I mean, they're great cities. They have amazing human resources and other things going for them. When we're talking about the economy in 2045, for example, no one knows exactly what it will look like, but the importance is to maintain overall good economic policies and a community and people-focused approach. Just one other thing to add in there. Some of these areas have a great asset in that they have transmission lines going to them. And here, let's just focus on the Hunter, for example. Those transmission lines are an inflexible asset. They're going there, and really it makes sense to be utilising them by investing and encouraging investment in solar and wind and storage as well in those locations. So it is possible to look at specific cases and tell narratives about what might be happening, and that can be important. Also, at the same time, it's important to realise we don't know everything, and to make sure that along the way, initiatives like the Latrobe Valley Authority, and just briefly on that, that was set up by the Victorian government with this issue in mind of what will happen to the local economy, what can we do about it. And the Latrobe Valley Authority has done all sorts of things. They've invested directly in initiatives, community level initiatives. There have been business subsidies for businesses investing in the area. Those types of approaches can really have an effect at that local level as well.
Yes, and you can see from that example the emphasis on independent authorities coordinating the transition. Can we move to Tenant on this theme? I'm interested in the different scales you're thinking of when it comes to industrial strategy. What parts of government do you see having opportunities to activate a fair and equitable and frankly fast transition that works for these frontline communities that have come up in our discussion so far?
So there's two very relevant proposals from the new federal government that are likely to play important roles in what they do in this space. They don't yet have a clear transition authority or similar body in mind. That might emerge. There's certainly a lot of encouragement to them from many quarters for something like that. But they do have the proposed enhanced safeguard mechanism, or Safeguard 2, which could potentially provide an important policy signal for transition, including both sticks and carrots, as long as that is expected to be sustained over a long period. And they have a $15 billion fund for finance, guarantees and equity investments in a range of industry sectors of opportunity, including several of those that we've spoken about already this evening. Clean metals, critical minerals, and transition, clean energy transition in the economy. So that's envisaged to operate in a similar way to the current Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which has been quite a successful model so far within its existing scope of operations. And so to us, it looks like those two things together could play an important role in both incentivising transition and providing capital availability to make the investments that are needed to get there. But actually relating those things to the communities that have the most at risk in the transition that's going on overseas, on the demand side of our current energy exports, is not guaranteed to happen. I'll just add one further thought, which is to Toby's point about comparative advantage. One of the complicating factors here is that the world is changing, and it can be a little hard to be very confident of what comparative advantage is at a point in time, both because what's required for global net zero transition is just such colossal scale up of lithium and battery supply chains, of a whole bunch of supply chains, that there probably is scope for considerable expansion in output, even in places that are not the absolute best places in the world to do some of those things, simply because the scale required is so large. And also the transformation that is taking shape in manufacturing around the world, where it is becoming more automated, more capital intensive, less dependent on labour, may make Australia and other advanced economies more relevant places for expansion of some of the manufacturing side of these activities, where we might have 5 years ago, 10 years ago, some doubts about whether this was a sensible place to do those things. Where this really gets questionable is around, say, the vehicle industry. Maybe Australia is still not a great place to assemble cars, but maybe we are a great place to make batteries that will go into vehicles and into homes and into just about everything else.
Great, thanks, Tenant. I think this is a really nice direction to take the discussion, thinking about Paul's comments earlier about needing to think about how we fit into global supply chains. And I also understand that you're closely watching the international developments with regards to net zero targets and forms of bilateral partnerships, for instance, the one between Australia and Indonesia. So can you update us on how climate policy and negotiations in the international arena are shaping the global picture?
What a week it has been for the Australia-Indonesia relationship. The images from Jakarta, I think, are very positive, and it's great to see the announcement from Australia of a $200 million commitment to clean energy and infrastructure as a partnership within Indonesia. What happens in our region is absolutely vital, in that the Asia Pacific is by far the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And if you look to the increment over coming decades, by far the world's potential emitter of that increment in terms of potential increase in global emissions. Things are moving, and in some markets in the Asia Pacific, clean energy is starting to take off. For example, in Vietnam, we have seen quite rapid investment in solar panels, and prices are important. That was largely in response to a feed-in tariff arrangement that was temporarily in place, but got the market moving. Also, a lot of interest in offshore wind and some onshore wind as well. In Indonesia, they're some years behind in terms of the uptake of solar PV, but huge potential there, including for export projects themselves to Indonesia and for floating solar PV projects close to Singapore and also elsewhere, including close to Jakarta. The net zero commitments are very important, and the long run strategy is quite clear. India, for example, net zero by 2070. China, of course, net zero commitment as well. This is really important for setting the signals to investors and to state-owned enterprises as well. Don't go the fossil route. For Australia, we really have a big opportunity to contribute to the region. And I very much agreed with Tenant's point about the importance of going for the outward-oriented approach there. If Australia could emerge as a large producer and exporter of not everything, but of a few low-carbon products, really we could play a key role in helping the region and also in creating jobs here locally as well. So really, to my mind, the very key thing Australia can do is make that export transition and start to do the hard work involved in that. The long run trajectories and outlooks for coal and natural gas are not strong, but the long run outlook for some of these clean commodities is strong. Countries such as Japan and others would like them. just one more thing, and then I'll hand back. Part of that outward orientation is investment as well. Australia is a capital importing country, and if we're to pull this off, we're going to need huge capital inflows, and some of those ideally should be from the region as well. For example, Indonesia is currently quite a small capital investor in Australia. Is that going to be maintained until 2050? There are huge opportunities for investment flows from around the world, and in particular our region, in low carbon activities in Australia.
Would I be able to add something to that?
Yes, thank you, Sophia.
Fierce agreement. Thank you. I was just at the National Australian Energy Week conference yesterday, presenting on a panel, and one of the CEOs of an Australian energy company was telling me privately that for the last 9 years we've been toing and froing about targets, and then we finally set a target last year, and all of a sudden people are turning around and saying, oh well, so how are we going to get there now? Whereas we could have been spending that valuable time talking about targets, actually creating a plan of attack and developing the technologies and coordinating. And so he was like, I'm quite relieved now, because now we can just get on with it. So I love talking about 2050 or net zero targets, but it's like, it's COP21 news. We've got, the interim 2030 targets that we need to be focusing on, and also just getting on with the plan of attack. From MCI's perspective and a CCU industry perspective, there's trillions of dollars being unlocked in global finance, in public and private finance, in clean technology, in places like, the leaders in the world, like the EU and even in America. There's so much money that we risk Australia being left behind because our targets aren't competitive, and therefore what's going to make our clean technologies stay here, develop the technologies here, and then export them to the world, as opposed to the other way around, which has become laggards and then end up having to import the technologies at the end of the day. And just one more thing, sorry. This week has been such a tumultuous week regarding, the price of gas and the cost of living in Australia. And there's a real need for us to be able to walk and chew gum and to solve many nuanced, complicated problems all at once, and not taking our eye off the ball. We see in America a bit of a walk back from a lot of green targets, and now the exploration for new gas, whilst also claiming that they want to reduce emissions. I want to really make sure that we remember in Australia that we need to still be looking at net zero by 2050, because if we don't hit that target, all of the inequalities and injustices in our existing system are going to become exacerbated. We know how bad it will be if we don't hit that target, but there's going to be many compelling reasons to take our eye off that ball. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Can I come back to you on the question of inequality, but just see if Tenant and Toby want to respond to international policy developments. Tenant, I'm particularly interested in whether you've got some thoughts on the developments in carbon border adjustment policies and their impact on Australia, but anything else that's coming up for you with regards to what Paul and Sophia have just said.
So carbon border adjustments are of great interest. There's a vote coming up in the European Parliament sometime in the next few hours on support for adoption of the CBAM proposed in Europe. I expect that will be adopted, but there's a bit of argy-bargy left to go about the details. Our analysis of these border adjustments, which involve imposing a cost on imports of carbon-intensive goods equivalent to the cost imposed on domestic producers, is that in the near term, Australian industry does not face a threat from them. They will take a bit of getting used to, but they're likely to be profit neutral or close to it for Australian exporters in the near term. However, over time, those businesses that are able to both reduce their emissions intensity relative to other producers and to demonstrate with good data that that is the case will get more competitive in markets that apply a CBAM, and those who can't make those investments will lose competitiveness. So it does have an impact that builds up over time, but it's not a question of, you know, being smashed with a tariff hammer on day one. This is a sort of mechanism that we will learn a lot from what Europe does. Others will be watching very closely too. And down the track, it might be a mechanism that is actually relevant to the Australian policy discussion. I'll just make one extra point, which is about those international price pressures, coal and gas price pressures that Sophia was referring to. They are a very big deal. Yes, they are providing an incentive for expanded production from fossil suppliers, although getting that extra production going is can be a slow process. But those prices are also an enormous incentive to accelerate the transition that we're talking about. And so I'll share just one more slide. Which is a chart of the energy expenditure in the blue bars, energy expenditure of different sectors of the Australian economy. The orange bars stacked on top is today's electricity and gas price increases if they fully flowed through to those sectors. And what we see is that for an awful lot of the economy, this is neither here nor there, really, either way. Of course, you'll always notice when a cost doubles or quadruples. But that this is a huge difference for metals, for non-metallic mineral products, pulp and paper, for chemicals, and even quite noticeable for food processing. And so the incentive to accelerate the transition from natural gas use and from coal-intensive electricity is very strong. Actually making that transition happen faster over the next few years. We should not underestimate the complexity of that acceleration, but the incentive is very strong indeed, because we are going to be paying through the nose for conventional energy, for the status quo, for a long time if we don't act fast.
And we can underscore that as well, just with the CBAM. The CBAM will be also adopted by the US, Japan, South Korea. Japan and South Korea almost certainly, but the US, it's looking very likely. And the opportunities that Tenant spoke to, that they are not insignificant if we decarbonise steel and aluminium and other commodities, they become extra competitive versus China and Russian and other countries that are not going to decarbonise at the same rate or on the same scale. So that's really a compelling argument too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe to come in on a few things. So Tenant, I think, took the words out of my mouth. Or, you know, also to respond to Sophia's earlier point about keeping our eye on the ball, even when macro conditions change and the debate changes. Like the big macroeconomic story at the moment is global inflationary pressures. Like the most deflationary thing you could do would be to switch to ubiquitous, cheap energy. Like if energy is provided at zero marginal cost, that's going to take a lot of inflationary pressure out of the system. A couple of other things on the net zero agreements that Paul was talking about. Like absolutely, that's a big driver and a big signal. In some previous work that we did about 18 months ago, we looked at sort of the 20 plus top trading partners, countries that Australia trades with, by trading volume. Those countries, over 80% of our exports go to places that have net zero targets in place. And that was 18 months ago. So that was before like the latest COP cycle. It will be even higher now. Like the fact is we're exporting to countries that are not going to be buying our key exports in 30 years' time. And that's, that's a big motivator, I guess, for this discussion, and hopefully a big signal to industry. The one other bit that I did want to respond to just while I was speaking is, I think both Paul and Tenant had made good points about comparative advantage and sort of understanding what the economy is going to look like in the future. I guess Paul was saying, no one's going to know what the economy of 2045 is going to look like, and what our advantage will be at that point in time. And Tenant was saying that if there's a big gap between demand and supply, well, we could still take advantage there, even if Australia isn't necessarily right at the frontier. And I guess I wanted to wholeheartedly agree with those points and actually bring in an idea that I think had a bit of a heyday a few years ago, this idea of mission-driven policy. It was something the economist Mariana Mazzucato spoke a lot about. And I think, taking that frame to industrial strategy is kind of helpful, because in that framing, part of it's about the mission you're trying to achieve, but part of it's also all the things that you get alongside pursuing a big mission. So, for example, Tenant spoke about producing batteries for cars. Maybe that's something where there's so much demand, we could do it, and we could invest a lot of money in doing it. And, maybe in 30 years' time, after running an industry for 30 years, it turns out that another country comes along that can do it better, and maybe we lose that industry and it's not an investment that we stick with for the long term. But you think about what we would get if we made a big bet on that. We'd have a lot of factories and plant with very, very sophisticated advanced robotics and manufacturing capabilities. We'd have a lot of skills and know-how that we don't currently have in the country. So we'd have a lot of very highly skilled managers and workers that could go on to start different businesses maybe in the same value chain, maybe breaking into new value chains. In pursuing a big industrial mission, it's not, I guess, you can easily get caught up in thinking that the goal is about picking winners. And I guess I wanted to say that it's not so much about picking winners, it's more about going on the journey and building up a big agglomeration of skills, talent, capital, infrastructure that can then be used and kind of put to whatever the good use is in the economy of 2045, which, as Paul said, no one knows what Australia's comparative advantage will be at that point in time.
Great, thanks so much, Toby. Now we're about to move to questions from our audience, but Sophia, as a final word, did you want to reflect any more on this question of inequality in the industrial transitions before us, and perhaps other panelists want to speak to that as well?
Yeah, I suppose my main thoughts on that are similar to what I just said, but we know for a fact that every tonne of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere is contributing to warming. We know that our economy currently relies on some of the processes that do emit those molecules, but we know that we have a number of inequality problems in our Australian society. I think that I'm very encouraged by the emergence of the teal independence in Australia, because there has been a lack of diversity in the decision-making rooms of power, which have in some ways contributed to the system being not that fair. So I think that that's a really good sign of change, but also, yes, if we do continue down the catastrophic warming scenario, if we do go to a 4-degree scenario, for instance, the existing inequalities will be much worse. And we know that climate change disproportionately affects poor people, women, and other. Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone wants to add to it, but.
Yeah, did you want to say anything, particularly on maybe the labour impacts and the cost of living question?
Just one very specific inequality in Australia is for renters. We recently released a study where we compared renting households to otherwise similar households with similar wealth levels, income levels, and so on. Renters are paying more for energy, they're using more energy, and it's a pretty clear story. Landlords are not investing. They don't have the full incentive to invest in energy efficiency. Renters are struggling through cold winters, hot summer nights, and so on, and end up spending more on energy. This is something that we could target. Australia could be doing much better on this specific inequality that affects quite a few lives. How? Well, we could be incentivising rental providers, landlords to be investing in energy efficiency improvements, insulation, improved sealing of windows and so on. Also standards and requirements as well. When we look at Australia compared to some other places like Europe and Japan, again, we're so far behind. It's one of the key things we really should be picking up on.
Great. Thanks, Paul. I'm going to start us off with our first question from the floor. If there's anyone in this room that has a question, I'd also like you to put your hands up so I can make a note. But we'll start with a question from a colleague in Indonesia. Hello, Nettie, who works for the Indonesian government in the field of national resilience. We're very pleased to see you in our audience. And Nettie's asking about what the specific variables are that need to exist to improve all countries' industrial sectors as we decarbonise. What are your priorities when it comes to thinking through this transition? We need to do a lot, I assume. We can't do everything. What are those key variables that you would advise Nettie to be thinking about?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. I think, and if so, you know, interpreting the question as key variables that are kind of universal.
That must exist to improve the economy.
That must exist for all countries. And I guess the challenge for that question is, you know, every country is going to be in a different position in terms of like what industries they're going to be the strongest at, what their comparative advantage might be. There's certainly, if there was a simple rule that worked for every country, the world would be homogenous. But I think there are some principles that we can think of. So one would be well-structured global markets or market design, or something about leveling the playing field when it comes to embedded emissions and trade. And, you know, on this, I won't say too much because on the panel, certainly Tenant has spent much more time thinking about trade and border adjustments, much more time than I have. But there's certainly structures that we can build into the global trade arrangements and infrastructure that make it easier for countries that can find a comparative advantage in low carbon manufacturing relative to their peer countries. You know, we want those countries to succeed and to build up those industries. The other thing that I would say would be some form of trade in energy. So energy is a big input into a lot of industries and a lot of economic activity. I think at the moment we've got an energy infrastructure that's, you know, heavily reliant on pipelines and ships that carry fossil fuels. So I think what's going to be important universally for all countries, and particularly for countries that don't have their own renewable energy endowments, is some kind of global infrastructure for the trade of energy. And, you know, that could be ammonia as some kind of like standard tool to transport hydrogen in liquid form. It could be interconnector cables to transport electrons. I think there's a lot of options, and we're probably going to go through an uncomfortable period as the global economy tries and figures out what works and what doesn't. But I think that's going to be a critical piece of infrastructure, you know, to answer the question of what do we need for all countries to be able to tackle this challenge.
Great. Thanks, Toby.
I'll just add one point there.
Yeah.
Just the active public engagement for social license to operate is just so crucial, because we can't just impose, industries can't just impose shocks into the country because there's a change. You'll lose the public and voters, and then you'll end up having larger problems overall. So I just wanted to note that.
So coming back to that community-led policy, all levels of government coordinating. Yeah, great.
One thing we know is that we don't have to wait for new technologies. So Neti, if we're thinking about the case of Indonesia, Indonesia's not very windy, but has a lot of sun. The very key number one policy lever to be pulling would be to be aiming to be bringing a lot of solar into the grid. And that's utility scale and also rooftop solar as well. So Toby mentioned the idea of missions for countries, a solar mission for Indonesia. That would be the very number one lever to pull. Some other things are also very important, including electric vehicles. They are at the heart of decarbonising that sector, although that will take time. Some other activities are more difficult. Steel production, for example, it will take time. Globally, we need to be investing in research and development, but we don't have to wait to decarbonise. We really could be focusing on those very key technologies that are already good and are still improving, but already good, solar and wind. And in Indonesia's case, for storage, there are lots of opportunities to use pumped hydro storage. And colleagues here at ANU, Andrew Blakers and David Silalahi and others have been looking at Indonesia's case. Where could off-river pumped hydro go? And could that really be the pillar for energy storage in Indonesia? They have a recent piece in The Conversation where they conclude very much, yes, there are lots of potential sites for that.
Tenant, did you have a comment in relation to this question?
So two seemingly contradictory points, which is that one, a healthy, vibrant global trade regime that does lower, not raise barriers to trade between nations is quite important to opening and sustaining opportunities for countries to participate in clean economy opportunity. But two is that carbon border adjustments are probably quite important as well. They're not really contradictory points because a well-designed border adjustment is about genuinely leveling the domestic playing field rather than keeping exports out. But a very important thing for countries in many respects, but particularly if CBAMs do take off, is having solid domestic carbon and energy accounting systems that companies are familiar with and that produce results that have international credibility. Capacity building, both at the national level and the company level for carbon and energy accounting is quite important to enable them to participate fully and have easier access as these trade and climate measures proliferate.
Great. Thanks very much. We have a question in the room. Hello. Will the audio pick up? Yeah, inside. Yeah. If you could introduce yourself and ask the question, that'd be great.
My name is Tu Yu. I'm working as a research official at Procter for Energy Transaction Spoke. So my question is, as we all know, carbon market is an effective tool that has been introduced during 2012 to 2014. And in 2015, Australia had also linked to EU ETS for a short period. Is that possible to bring it back, or do we have an alternative of carbon market to play the role of motivating low carbon development?
Do you want to kick us off with that, Paul or Tenant?
Tenant looks
Okay. Is there a possibility for bringing back Australia's carbon market?
So, not in its former form. The specifics of the 2012 to 14 policy are formally gone. The safeguard mechanism could evolve and will evolve in a way that operates comparably, but with some politically important differences. I don't think that there is a likelihood anytime soon of a direct linkage between Australia's carbon market. We do have one today for voluntary and government purchasing, but I don't think there's likelihood of a linkage between that and the European market anytime soon, because Europe is keeping international offsets out of their domestic carbon market, and maybe at some point we'll have established a compliance system that through the safeguard that can be linked to the EU ETS, but that is some years off at the closest.
Great. Thanks, Tenant. Did you want to pick up on that?
Oh, just to agree, it would have been better if we had kept the scheme that we had before. It's a pity we don't have it. But we do actually have a scheme there, the safeguard mechanism. If it's tightened, it could become more effective. And basically, it's a baseline and credit emissions trading scheme. And we know that there is a carbon price, and that if that is tightened, that really could help to change production and investment decisions to help reduce emissions.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. MCI itself, we received our first $9 million of funding, our seed funding, out of a 2013 Gillard government when we had an ETS, which was exactly what the mechanism was designed to do, encouraging investment and innovation in carbon. So that's quite interesting. It was very hard to weather the storm of the following years and all the uncertainty around that. But what's pretty clear to me now is that it's toxic politically. So we'll probably never go back, but we'll design something in the future. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Sophia. We've got a question up the back here. If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Liz. I'm part of the knowledge sharing team at Arena. Probably my question is more for Sophia, but happy to hear anyone else. So you mentioned the role of carbon capture and utilization in hard to abate sectors. And Paul mentioned a few times, like the opportunities in the aluminium and green steel kind of industry. So do you see any specific roles for that technology specifically for the green aluminium and green steel industries?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So green steel in particular is quite a compelling business case in Australia in terms of, green as in utilisation of emissions in the transition. Absolutely. These industries don't have clear other pathways to decarbonise that aren't hydrogen in the future. So there's a real explosion of different interests in technology readiness level 4 to 6 to 7 application technologies. There are a few around the world, but also a couple in Australia that are quite exciting. I'm happy to talk about them in more detail. Yeah.
Thank you.
And they were actually, a lot of those technology groups were outlined in the technology investment roadmap, which I'm not really sure what's going to happen with this. Some technologies are going to be important for a net zero future, but it's not really clear what's going to happen with regard to that. I'm sure you would know a little bit more being from Arena. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. So I have a question on Zoom for Tenant. Can you read it, Tenant, from Will Howard?
Yep.
Will has asked you, how quickly could the sectors in your second slide scale up to significant percentages of their current emissions, particularly interested in ammonium production?
Yeah. So this is a challenge because so currently ammonia producers take methane, natural gas, and they reform it to make hydrogen, and then they add nitrogen to the hydrogen to make ammonia. So you would think, oh, great, well, then we just get a clean source of ammonia and job done. We've decarbonised that sector. But the way they're currently set up, they actually need the energy produced in the conversion process to run the rest of the conversion process. So we're not just talking about taking an off-site different source of hydrogen. You need to basically replace the facility with a new one that has a different energy source. So that is entirely possible. The problem has been that it was like green hydrogen looked quite expensive relative to natural gas, and you need a great big investment and the confidence to make that investment. Now, if we face, as it appears, a decade of high natural gas prices, then the attractiveness of green hydrogen is quite different. And it is possible that we will be able to see locally and globally a faster transition because the cost relativities are shifting. And the acceleration of hydrogen investments in Europe and elsewhere, partly towards their emissions goals, partly towards their get off Russian gas goals, is going beyond the next couple of years of supply chain chaos, going to accelerate the progress of those technologies down the cost curve because they're heavily dependent on the extent of global deployment and the learning that provides. So I don't underestimate the challenges of this acceleration, but we actually do have an opportunity to go further faster than we might have thought recently.
Excellent. Thanks, Tenant. I have a question about community solar batteries. Is there anyone on this panel that feels able to answer it? So Alison Ford. Oh, great. Thank you. A tentative hand from Tenant. So Alison Ford has asked, can anyone shed some light, please, on why community solar batteries have not been more popular?
Like a very short version is a lot of people like the idea, but depending on how you do them, I mean, the cost of the batteries themselves has been quite high. That has been coming down, although everything has gotten more expensive in the last 18 months. But the real challenge is, depending on how you do them, they actually may not have a great incentive effect. So if they are structured as there's this battery and people in the community trade energy into and out of the battery, a study by AGL recently, who were trying to get one of these projects up, found that on the Mornington Peninsula, aside from not quite penciling out yet, the battery would incentivize people to use more energy at peak times and less during the day, when actually what we want to do is to incentivize people to shift energy into the middle of the day when we've got a solar surplus. So the detail of how you do it really matters.
Yes, absolutely. Paul, did you have thoughts on solar batteries in things like the solar mission in Indonesia or anywhere else?
Well, they're certainly part of the solution, and things are moving forward there in that 10 years ago, if you were to run a tendering process for supply of electricity on a remote island in Indonesia or India or elsewhere, well, probably you would have diesel as a big part of your submission of your project. But these days, batteries can be competitive and are competitive, and in general, the costs are coming down. So really, it's very important at the small scale, if we're thinking about Indonesia's many islands, to be deploying those batteries and to be starting to improve the supply chains. One of the beauties of the energy transition is that we can move away from shipping diesel between many different islands around the world. And increasingly, the key technologies will be solar, batteries, perhaps some biogas from the local community. Sometimes there's a piggery or something like that that can supply bio and other bio as well. Yeah, a really important part going forward. And for larger scale energy storage, pumped hydro.
Of course, yeah. Thank you. Picking up on that theme of transition needing a whole of supply chain approach, we have a question directed to Tenant, but perhaps other panellists will want to get in on this. So Otto asks, on housing, how can we get people interested in building and inhabiting housing stock that's designed efficiently and sized appropriately?
So the sizing part of it is a challenging arena for policy, because while it's true that reducing consumption per se, and a smaller house is a form of reduced consumption. In a model that makes it much easier to achieve global net zero. A lot of people like big houses if they can afford them, if they can get them. They'll make trade-offs with location and amenity and so on, but all things being equal, a lot of people like a big space. So this is really challenging. Culture change does happen. It's a real thing. It's hard to put into a model. I think that there's a lot of conversation to be had about the size of consumption and when is bigger, not better. But in terms of things that policymakers can do and not like turn pale with the fear of political backlash, I think the current conversation about upgrading our national construction code to encourage not smaller, but definitely more energy efficient and temperature safe dwellings is a very important one. There's arguments about the detail, but having a new housing stock that is safe and efficient for people to live in a changing climate is really important.
Great. Thanks, Tenant. Any other thoughts on housing?
Just to jump in back on the story of rental properties. If you look at the case of Queensland, for example, there are standards for rental properties. The property must have a roof, for example. Those could go a little bit further. It's all about getting the balance right, but bringing in some energy efficiency requirements is really important. You don't want to be requiring extremely expensive energy efficiency improvements, retrofits, but there are some simple steps that could be taken to make sure that renters are quite comfortable in the knowledge at least the properties that they're moving into will meet a basic standard in terms of energy efficiency.
Yeah. Did you have?
Yeah, I guess just using nudge economics and thinking about the markets. I guess just falling back on basic principles, make the most sustainable and the lowest carbon impact dwellings the cheapest is probably the way that we should be incentivizing change. I really connect with what you're saying, Paul, about renters, because I rented through the bushfires and lived through many Canberra winters in a low quality rental, and I know how much more money you have to spend on all of those things. Yeah, so just using the market to make the best choice the cheapest and the most approachable for people is my answer.
And maybe just to jump in as as Tenant was answering, I saw a question pop up on the Zoom saying, do we have time for cultural change, which I think is a really pertinent question. One of the challenges is that a lot of the solutions to decarbonise the economy make consumption cheaper, make consumption easier, and it's going to be very hard without cultural change. And so, so the question, do we have time for cultural change? It's something that we're all, as a community, as a society, going to need to put a lot of effort into, so that a lot of the technological gains don't just get turned into increased consumption. And actually it ties into the discussion about solar batteries. Do we use solar batteries plus behavior change to solve the problem, or do we use solar batteries to enable us to continue using or to continue having unsustainable patterns of demand and of behavior? So yeah, very pertinent question. Do we have time for cultural change? I think we have to make that a big part of the solution, because I don't think we can just create incentives or markets or subsidies to solve the problem, as much as that is going to be a big part of it.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to close the questions now, and I want to invite the panel maybe to lever off those final, this most recent comment on change. What are the one or two take-home messages you have for our audience about the changes ahead? While you're thinking about that, I look at my notes and I can see some really insightful comments about needing effective action on all scales, from the community-led engagement and consultation all the way up, not just to the national level, but talking about well-structured global markets and a whole of supply chain approach. There's a lot of data gathering to do to be sensitive to the needs of people as we go through industrial transition, a role for strategic public finance, and that overall effective governance theme. Then that's what I've heard from you. Any additional take-home thoughts from the panel? Should we go in reverse order? Tenant, do you want to give us your final goodbye comments?
Well, so the painful part of industry transition, we don't get a choice about whether we go through it or not. It's going to be determined by decisions made in customer countries overseas. We can only determine how well we deal with it, not whether we have to. There are a lot of opportunities in the positive side of transition, but also just as a matter of perspective, most people today don't work in energy or energy intensive activities. Most people work in services. And in 2030, 2040, 2050, most people are going to work in services. So, we have advantage and opportunity to seize. But the biggest thing of all is, do we globally and nationally succeed in charting a safer course on climate? Because that's going to have a bigger impact on most people and on the economy, but on like life and happiness, than the specifics of most of the industry transition side.
Great. Thanks, Tenant. Sophia?
Yep. So ambition and leadership is really important. We need to remember to be optimistic about the future, because Australia is so endowed with all of these wonderful opportunities and resources, natural resources, that we can take advantage of, build up industries, create profits, and also help the rest of the world to decarbonise. It's really exciting. So it's important to keep up like the knowledge that we will get there, because we've got so many smart brains working on this problem in different ways. And so that's an important thing to remember. And just not to take our eye off the ball, because we are also capable of so much complexity, of solving complex problems at once. And so that's, I guess, normally I'm just 100% optimistic, but this week has been really hard. So it's just, let's do lots of things at once.
Great, thank you. Walking and chewing gum.
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah, so I'd come in with 2 points. The first one is the importance of remaining outward oriented and ramping that up. We have a huge potential to work with countries in the region in partnerships for clean energy. And it's in everyone's interest for us to do so. Our generation really has the potential to make a huge difference in steering that emission trajectory way down. Number 2 is avoiding waste and keeping the economics in mind. Along the way, there are many decisions to be made about how to design markets and how to allocate resources as we go along this path of energy transition. So far, projects such as carbon capture and storage for thermal coal, for coal-fired power stations, the economics are just not looking good. The projects are expensive, the track record, not great. We could be using resources much more wisely by investing in the technologies that are relatively cheap, that do the job. Really, the answer is a lot of solar and wind. And there's a challenge there, lots of challenges in bringing those technologies in, managing the grid well. We need to have our smartest minds working on it, and keep the economics in mind. Let's make the best decisions that don't involve too much waste on projects that are unlikely to be successful.
Great. And closing remarks?
Yeah, I think, 2 points. One is that is that as Tenant said, the transition is going to happen to some extent, whether we like it or not. What we control is the response. And I think there's a real moment here where people are kind of crying out for a coordinating vision. So a very, very exciting time really for the country as kind of workers, communities, industries, investors. If they're given a kind of North Star, or I guess in the Southern Hemisphere, 2 pointers to follow, I think there's big potential to be gained there from tapping into the enthusiasm and the willingness to kind of get behind a positive transition. So, you know, that's I guess we'll all be keeping an eye on what the new government comes out with in the coming months. And I guess, again, I'll just sort of reiterate how I finished my opening remarks, which is to say that really the idea of climate and the economy being two separate issues, we have to move beyond that, because if there's like one thing that I think came through in everything that we said, it's that doing the right thing for climate change is also going to be the right thing for our economy and for our future prosperity, and just making that link crystal clear in everything we do and kind of all the discussions we have, I think will be an important part of, you know, as Sophia said, keeping our eye on that ball over the long term.
Great. Thank you so much to our panellists tonight. And thank you also to the tireless staff of the Institute of Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. None of this is possible without them. And to our partners tonight, the Centre for Policy Development and CO2 Value Australia. Now, before we get on with the fast and fair industrial transformation, we do have time with those of you in the room to go on to some canapes and snacks out there. Otherwise, goodbye, and thank you very much to our excellent online audience as well.